Part 1. The Quiet World Before the Revolution. Picture this for a moment. It's the early 1700s. The world feels slower, quieter, and far less connected than the one we know today. Across the vast Atlantic Ocean sits a collection of small colonies along the eastern edge of North America. To most people living there, these colonies are simply distant extensions of the British Empire. Life here isn't glamorous. It's not the grand cities of Europe. Instead, it's farmland, wooden homes, small villages, muddy roads, and endless forests stretching far beyond the horizon. The people living here wake up early, long before the sun fully rises. Farmers step outside into the cold morning air, checking their animals and fields. Merchants open small shops along narrow streets. Blacksmiths begin hammering metal in their workshops, sparks jumping through the dim morning light. It's a simple world, and for many years it works. These colonies depend heavily on Great Britain. Ships constantly travel back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, carrying goods like tobacco, sugar, timber, and cotton. In return, the colonies receive manufactured items from Europe. Tools, cloth, tea, and all sorts of things the colonies cannot easily produce themselves. To the British government, the colonies exist mainly for one reason: trade. The colonies produce raw materials, and Britain sells finished products. It's an economic system that benefits the empire. At least that's how it looks on paper. But life in the colonies slowly begins to change. As years pass, the population grows rapidly. More settlers arrive from Europe every year. Small towns grow into busy port cities. Roads expand. Trade increases. People living in the colonies begin to develop something new, a sense of identity. They still consider themselves British citizens, but their daily lives are very different from the people living in England. Colonists must survive harsh winters, deal with difficult farming conditions, and build entire communities from scratch. This rugged lifestyle shapes their thinking. They begin to value independence, self-reliance, and freedom. These ideas slowly grow stronger over time. But at this moment in history, few people imagine that these colonies could ever become an independent nation. The idea seems almost impossible. After all, the British Empire is one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Its navy dominates the oceans. Its armies are experienced and well-equipped. Its wealth stretches across continents. Compared to that massive empire, the colonies are small, scattered, and vulnerable. Still, change is quietly beginning. And it begins with something simple: money. The British government has been fighting expensive wars across the globe. These wars cost enormous amounts of money, and the empire needs to recover those losses. So British leaders start looking at the American colonies. From their perspective, the colonies should help pay for the protection Britain provides. After all, British soldiers defend the colonies from foreign threats. British ships patrol the Atlantic. British money supports the entire imperial system. So the government begins introducing new taxes. At first, these taxes seem small, but the colonists quickly notice something troubling. They have no representation in the British Parliament. No one from the colonies gets to vote on these taxes. This sparks the beginning of a phrase that will echo throughout history: no taxation without representation. At first, this phrase spreads quietly through conversations in taverns and meeting halls. Merchants complain about trade restrictions. Farmers worry about rising costs. Lawyers and thinkers begin writing essays questioning British authority. Still, most colonists don't want revolution. They simply want fairness. They want a voice in the decisions affecting their lives. But the British government doesn't see it that way. From London, the colonies appear distant and difficult to manage. Leaders believe stronger control is necessary. So instead of backing down, they introduce even more regulations. Trade laws tighten, taxes increase, and tensions slowly rise. At first, these tensions remain peaceful. Colonists organize boycotts against British goods. Merchants refuse to import certain products. Communities hold meetings discussing their rights as British citizens. But beneath the calm surface, frustration continues to grow. It grows in the docks of Boston. It grows in the busy streets of Philadelphia. It grows in the farms of Virginia. And it grows in the minds of people who are beginning to imagine a very different future. One where they control their own destiny. One where they decide their own laws. One where they are no longer simply colonies of a distant empire, But those dreams still feel distant. For now, the colonies continue living their daily lives. Ships arrive in port, markets open each morning, children grow up learning trades from their parents. The world moves slowly forward, yet something important is happening beneath the surface. Ideas are spreading. Ideas about liberty, about representation, about the rights of ordinary people. And these ideas are powerful, because once people begin thinking about freedom, it becomes very difficult to ignore. Over the coming years, these ideas will ignite debates, protests, and eventually open conflict. But that moment hasn't arrived yet. For now, the colonies remain part of the British Empire. The forests remain quiet. The towns continue growing. And most people still believe their future lies within the empire. They have no idea that within a few decades, their world will change forever. A revolution is slowly approaching, but like many turning points in history, it begins quietly, almost invisibly, like the first faint light before sunrise. And the next chapter of this story will reveal how small disagreements over taxes slowly transformed into one of the most important revolutions in human history. Part 2. The war that changed everything. To truly understand how the American Revolution began, we need to step back for a moment and look at a war that most colonists never expected to change their lives so dramatically. It's the mid-1700s. Across North America, two massive European powers are quietly competing for land, influence, and control. On one side stands Great Britain, with its chain of colonies stretching along the Atlantic coast. On the other side stands France. The French control enormous territories across Canada and deep into the Mississippi River Valley. Their trading posts stretch through forests, rivers, and mountains that most Europeans have barely explored. For years, these two empires have watched each other carefully. Both want control of the same land, and sooner or later, conflict becomes unavoidable. The tension finally erupts into a major conflict known as the French and Indian War, which begins in 1754. Despite the name, this war is actually part of a much larger global struggle between Britain and France, often called the 7 Years' War. But for the colonists living in North America, this war feels very personal. Battles take place close to their homes. Armies march through forests and frontier towns. Small settlements suddenly find themselves caught between powerful empires. Young colonial soldiers join British forces to fight against the French and their Native American allies. One of these young soldiers, a man named George Washington. At this point, Washington is not the legendary leader history will later remember. He's simply a young officer from Virginia trying to prove himself in battle. The war is long, difficult, and expensive. Fighting takes place across massive distances, from dense forests in Canada to rivers deep in the American frontier. Both sides struggle to control key territories and trading routes. But eventually, after years of brutal fighting, Britain wins the war. By 1763, France loses most of its North American territories. On paper, this victory should be great news for the British colonies. The French threat has been eliminated. The colonies are safer than ever before. But there's a problem, a very expensive problem. Wars cost money, an enormous amount of money. By the end of the conflict, Britain is buried under massive debt. The government has spent huge sums paying soldiers, supplying armies, and maintaining its powerful navy. British leaders begin searching for ways to recover this money. And once again, their eyes turn toward the American colonies. From London's perspective, the solution seems obvious. The colonies benefited from the war. British soldiers protected them from French forces. British resources helped secure the land. So it only seems fair that the colonies should help pay the cost. At least, that's how British officials see it. But the colonists see things very differently. To them, the war was fought partly to expand Britain's empire, not simply to protect the colonies. And besides, many colonial soldiers fought in the war themselves. Many colonists paid local taxes to support military efforts. They don't believe they owe Britain anything extra. But the British government doesn't ask for permission. Instead, they begin introducing new laws. One of the first major ones is the Sugar Act of 1764. This law places taxes on imported sugar and molasses, which are important goods used in trade throughout the colonies. For merchants and traders, these taxes make business more difficult. But an even bigger shock arrives the following year. In 1765, the British government passes something called the Stamp Act. This law requires colonists to purchase special stamped paper for many everyday items, legal documents, newspapers, magazines, playing cards, even simple pamphlets. Almost every piece of printed paper now requires a government stamp, which means a tax. For the colonists, this feels like a huge change. It's the first time Britain has placed a direct internal tax on everyday activities within the colonies, and people are not happy. Almost immediately, protests begin appearing across colonial cities. In Boston, crowds gather in the streets. In New York and Philadelphia, angry colonists organize meetings to discuss what they see as unfair taxation. Newspapers publish essays criticizing British authority. Writers begin arguing that the colonies deserve representation in Parliament if they are expected to pay taxes. That famous phrase spreads quickly: no taxation without representation. For many colonists, this issue isn't just about money, it's about rights. They believe they deserve the same political rights as citizens living in Britain. But because the colonies have no representatives in Parliament, they have no voice in the laws being passed. This creates a growing sense of injustice. Protests become more organized. Groups like the Sons of Liberty form in several colonies. These groups encourage resistance against British policies. Sometimes this resistance is peaceful. Merchants refuse to import British goods. Colonists organize boycotts. Communities encourage people to buy local products instead of British ones. But sometimes the anger turns more intense. Tax collectors are threatened. Effigies of British officials are burned in the streets. Crowds gather outside government buildings, shouting their frustrations. British leaders are shocked by the reaction. They never expected the colonies to respond with such strong resistance. In London, many politicians still believe the colonists are simply overreacting. They assume the protests will eventually fade, but something deeper is happening in America. The protests are bringing colonists together. People from different colonies who rarely worked closely before are now sharing ideas and organizing resistance together. They begin to realize something important. They are stronger when they unite. In 1765, representatives from several colonies gather for an important meeting called the Stamp Act Congress. Here, colonial leaders formally protest the new taxes and send a message to the British government. They are loyal subjects of the crown, but they demand fair treatment. Back in Britain, merchants begin noticing something troubling. Colonial boycotts are hurting their businesses. British goods are no longer selling as easily in America. Economic pressure begins building. Eventually, Parliament decides to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. For a brief moment, the colonies celebrate. It seems like their protests worked. It feels like a victory. But the celebration doesn't last long. Because even though the Stamp Act is removed, Britain passes another law at the same time. A law called the Declaratory Act. This law quietly states that the British government still has the right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In other words, Britain is not giving up control. The conflict isn't over. In fact, it's only beginning. Over the next few years, more taxes, more protests, and more confrontations will follow, each one pushing the colonies and Britain further apart. And step by step, the idea of revolution will slowly grow from a distant thought into a very real possibility. Part 3. Tension in the streets. By the late 1760s, something had clearly changed in the American colonies. What once felt like distant disagreements between colonists and the British government had now begun to feel much more personal. People were no longer just debating taxes in quiet meeting halls. Now the tension was showing up in the streets, especially in one particular city, Boston. At the time, Boston was one of the most important ports in the American colonies. Ships arrived daily carrying goods, merchants traded across the Atlantic, and the town buzzed with activity from sunrise to sunset. But Boston had also become one of the loudest voices opposing British policies. Protests happened frequently. Crowds gathered in public squares. Speeches were delivered in taverns and meeting houses. Many Bostonians believed that Britain was slowly stripping away their rights, and the British government was starting to take notice. To maintain order and enforce the new laws, Britain decided to send soldiers to the colonies. In 1768, British troops arrived in Boston. For the people living there, this felt strange and uncomfortable. Imagine waking up one morning and seeing foreign soldiers marching through your streets, red uniforms, muskets on their shoulders, drums echoing through narrow colonial roads. Technically, these soldiers were not enemies. They were part of the same empire, but their presence still felt like an occupation. Many colonists began calling them redcoats. At first, interactions between soldiers and colonists were tense but manageable. But over time, things became worse. Boston was a crowded town, and suddenly hundreds of soldiers were living among the local population. They needed food, they needed places to stay, and sometimes they competed with colonists for jobs. Arguments started happening more frequently. A merchant might argue with a soldier at a marketplace. A group of sailors might insult a passing patrol. Small fights would break out in taverns. Nothing too serious at first, just the kind of tension you might expect when two frustrated groups are forced to live close together. But emotions were building, and eventually one cold evening in March of 1770, everything boiled over. It started with something small. A young apprentice began arguing with a British soldier outside a customs house. The disagreement quickly attracted attention. Soon a small crowd gathered. People began shouting at the soldier. More soldiers arrived to support him. The crowd grew larger. Snowballs were thrown. Insults filled the air. The situation became chaotic. In the confusion, someone shouted something that sounded like an order, and suddenly shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. Several others were wounded. The event shocked the entire city. News spread quickly across the colonies. This tragic moment would soon become known as the Boston Massacre. From the British perspective, the soldiers had been surrounded by an angry mob and acted in self-defense. But many colonists saw the event very differently. To them, it looked like British troops had fired on unarmed civilians. Newspapers printed dramatic descriptions of the incident. Artists created powerful illustrations showing British soldiers shooting into helpless crowds. These images spread rapidly, fueling anger across the colonies. One famous engraving by Paul Revere portrayed the event as a brutal attack by disciplined soldiers against innocent townspeople. Whether entirely accurate or not, the image had a powerful effect. It turned the Boston Massacre into a symbol of British oppression. Yet even during this tense time, some leaders tried to keep the situation under control. Interestingly, the British soldiers involved in the shooting were given a fair trial, and one of the lawyers defending them was a colonial patriot named John Adams. Adams believed strongly in justice and the rule of law. Even though he opposed British policies, he felt the soldiers deserved a proper defense. In the end, most of the soldiers were acquitted. Only 2 were found guilty of manslaughter. Still, the damage had already been done. Trust between the colonists and the British government had been badly shaken. Many people now believed that violence might eventually become unavoidable. But for the moment, tensions cooled slightly. British officials removed many of the unpopular taxes that had caused earlier protests. Trade resumed. Daily life slowly returned to normal, at least on the surface. But beneath that calm surface, resentment continued to grow. Colonists had seen soldiers in their streets, they had witnessed bloodshed, and they had begun asking a very serious question. What happens if Britain keeps pushing? Would the colonies eventually be forced to fight for their rights? At this stage, very few people were ready to talk openly about independence. Most colonists still hoped for compromise. They still believed that disagreements with Britain could be solved peacefully. But each new conflict made that hope a little weaker. And only a few years later, another event would push the colonies even closer to open rebellion. An event involving something surprisingly ordinary. The next chapter of this story will take us to one of the most famous protests in American history, the Boston Tea Party. Part 4. The Night of the Boston Tea Party. By the early 1770s, the tension between Britain and the American colonies had not disappeared. In fact, it had simply been waiting quietly beneath everyday life. People still worked their farms, ships still arrived in busy ports, markets still opened each morning. But many colonists were no longer thinking of themselves only as loyal subjects of the British Crown. They were beginning to see themselves as something slightly different, a community, a people with shared concerns. And slowly, the idea of independence was starting to appear in conversations. Still, most colonists did not want a full revolution. They simply wanted fairness. Yet, Britain continued to pass laws that made colonists feel ignored and controlled. One of these laws would lead to one of the most famous protests in American history, And surprisingly, the entire conflict centered around something simple: tea. At that time, tea was incredibly popular in the colonies. People drank it daily. It was a common part of social gatherings and quiet evenings at home. Most of this tea came from the powerful British East India Company, one of the largest trading companies in the world. But by the early 1770s, the company was struggling financially. The British government wanted to help the company recover. So in 1773, Parliament passed a new law called the Tea Act. At first glance, this law seemed harmless. It actually made tea cheaper for colonists by allowing the East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies without certain taxes. But the colonists quickly realized something important. Even though the tea was cheaper, it still included a small tax. And accepting that tea would mean accepting Britain's right to tax them without representation. To many colonists, this was about principle. If they allowed this tax to exist, it might lead to even more control in the future. So resistance began again. In several colonial cities, people refused to unload shipments of British tea. Some ships were turned away before they could even dock. But in Boston, the situation became more complicated. In late 1773, 3 ships carrying tea arrived in Boston Harbor. Under British law, the tea had to be unloaded and taxed within a certain number of days. Colonial leaders demanded the ships leave without unloading their cargo. But the British governor of Massachusetts refused. The deadline approached, and thousands of colonists gathered in Boston to decide what to do. On the evening of December 16, 1773, a large meeting was held at the Old South Meeting House. More than 5,000 people crowded inside and outside the building. Speakers debated the situation for hours. Finally, as night approached, it became clear that the tea would not be allowed to leave the harbor without action. And that's when something unusual happened. A group of colonists quietly left the meeting. They disguised themselves in simple clothing, and some wore items resembling Native American dress. This was partly to hide their identities and partly to symbolize that they were acting as Americans rather than British subjects. Moving through the dark streets of Boston, the group headed toward the harbor. The cold December air hung over the water. Ships rocked gently in the quiet harbor, and one by one, the protesters boarded the 3 tea ships. Working quickly and calmly, they began breaking open the large wooden chests filled with tea. Each chest weighed hundreds of pounds. Using axes and tools, they smashed them open and dumped the contents directly into the sea. Tea leaves poured into the water like dark clouds spreading across the harbor. For hours, the protesters worked in near silence. By the time they finished, 342 chests of tea had been thrown into Boston Harbor, an enormous amount of valuable cargo. And just like that, the Boston Tea Party was over. The protesters quietly left the ships and disappeared back into the city. But the message had been sent. The colonies would not quietly accept British authority without a voice. When news of the event reached Britain, the reaction was swift and furious. British leaders saw the destruction of the tea as a direct attack on imperial authority. They believed strong action was necessary to restore order. So Parliament passed a series of harsh laws in response. The colonists would soon call them the Intolerable Acts. These laws punished Massachusetts severely. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. The colony's self-government was restricted. British officials gained greater control over local decisions, and British soldiers were given expanded authority to maintain order. For the people of Boston, the consequences were immediate and painful. With the harbor closed, trade stopped. Workers lost their jobs. Food and supplies became harder to obtain. But instead of isolating Massachusetts, these punishments had an unexpected effect. They united the colonies even more. Across America, people began sending food and supplies to help the struggling citizens of Boston. Communities organized meetings to discuss the growing crisis. Colonial leaders realized something important. If Britain could punish one colony this harshly, it could punish all of them. So representatives from 12 colonies decided to meet together for the first time. In 1774, they gathered in Philadelphia for what became known as the First Continental Congress. This meeting would mark a major turning point. For the first time, the colonies were beginning to coordinate their resistance as a united group. Still, many leaders hoped conflict could be avoided. They sent messages to the British king asking for compromise. They asked for their rights as English citizens to be respected. But at the same time, something else was happening quietly across the colonies. Local militias began preparing for the possibility of war. Farmers practiced with muskets. Communities stored supplies, and colonial leaders began discussing what might happen if Britain refused to listen. The path toward revolution was becoming clearer, and very soon the first real battles would begin. The next chapter of our story will take us to a quiet Massachusetts town called Lexington, a place where a single morning in April would change history forever. Part 5. The first shots at Lexington and Concord. By the year 1775, the relationship between Great Britain and the American colonies had reached a fragile and dangerous point. For more than a decade, tensions had slowly built. Taxes had been protested, laws had been challenged, meetings had been held across the colonies. And while many people still hoped the conflict could be solved peacefully, others were beginning to prepare for something far more serious: war. Across Massachusetts, small local militias had begun organizing quietly. These militias were made up of ordinary people: farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, teachers, men who normally spent their days working fields or running small businesses. But now, in their spare time, they practiced marching and shooting with muskets, because no one knew exactly what might happen next, and the British government was starting to notice these preparations. British officials in Boston were growing concerned that the colonists were storing weapons and supplies in nearby towns. One place in particular caught their attention: a small town called Concord, located about 20 miles west of Boston. Reports suggested that colonial militias were hiding gunpowder, cannons, and other military supplies there. The British governor of Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, decided to act. He ordered a group of British soldiers to march from Boston to Concord and seize those weapons before the colonists could use them. The plan seemed simple enough. British troops were well trained and experienced. The colonial militias were just groups of local volunteers. It didn't seem like a serious challenge, but the colonists had their own network of communication. Word began spreading that British soldiers were preparing to move, and late on the night of April 18, 1775, two riders quietly left Boston on horseback. Their names would later become famous in American history: Paul Revere and William Dawes. Their mission was simple but urgent: ride through the countryside and warn the colonial militias that British troops were on the move. Under the dark night sky, the riders traveled quickly through small towns and farms, stopping at houses, knocking on doors, shouting warnings as they passed. "The British are coming." Church bells rang. Lanterns lit up windows. Militia members began gathering across the countryside. By the time British troops reached the town of Lexington early the next morning, something unexpected had happened. About 70 colonial militia members were already waiting on the town green. These men were not professional soldiers. They were ordinary citizens, standing together with muskets in their hands. Neither side truly wanted to start a war. The British commander ordered the militia to disperse. The colonial captain told his men not to fire unless fired upon. For a moment, the scene stood completely still. Cold morning air, two groups of armed men staring at each other across the green, and then suddenly a shot rang out. To this day, no one knows exactly who fired first. The sound shattered the silence. British soldiers fired a volley of musket shots. Colonial militia scattered as bullets flew across the field. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonial men lay dead. The first blood of the American Revolution had been spilled. After the brief clash, British troops continued their march toward Concord. When they arrived, they searched for weapons and supplies. But many of the colonial stores had already been moved or hidden. Meanwhile, colonial militias from surrounding towns were gathering rapidly. Hundreds of armed men were now moving toward Concord. When British troops began marching back toward Boston later that day, they faced a very different situation than they had that morning. Militia fighters lined the roads. They hid behind trees, stone walls, and fences. As the British marched along the narrow country road, colonial fighters began firing from multiple directions. This was not the traditional battlefield style of fighting the British Army was used to. Instead of standing in open fields, the colonists used the landscape for cover. The British soldiers suddenly found themselves under constant attack. Musket fire echoed through the countryside. Smoke drifted across fields and forests. The long march back to Boston turned into a dangerous retreat. By the time British troops finally reached the safety of Boston, they had suffered hundreds of casualties. News of the battles at Lexington and Concord spread quickly throughout the colonies. For many people, this moment changed everything. The conflict had moved beyond protests and arguments. Now there had been real fighting, real deaths, and many colonists believed there was no turning back. Militias across New England began mobilizing. Thousands of volunteers surrounded Boston, effectively trapping the British Army inside the city. This situation would soon become known as the Siege of Boston. At the same time, colonial leaders gathered once again in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. This time, their task was far more serious. They were no longer just protesting laws. Now they had to decide how to respond to an armed conflict with the most powerful empire in the world. And during this meeting, they would choose a leader who would become one of the most important figures in American history. A tall, quiet man from Virginia, a man named George Washington. The next chapter of our story will follow Washington as he takes command of a brand new army and prepares to face the British Empire. Part 6. George Washington and the birth of the Continental Army. After the battles at Lexington and Concord, the situation in the American colonies had changed dramatically. What had once been protests and political arguments had now turned into open conflict. Militia fighters surrounded the city of Boston, where thousands of British soldiers were now stationed. The British Army was powerful and well-trained. But the colonial fighters had something important as well: determination. Many of them believed they were fighting for their rights, their homes, and their future. Still, the colonies faced a major problem. They did not yet have a real army. The militias surrounding Boston were made up of volunteers from different colonies, each with their own leaders, equipment, and methods of fighting. If the colonies were going to resist Britain successfully, they needed organization, they needed leadership, and most importantly, they needed a united force. In May of 1775, representatives from the colonies gathered once again in Philadelphia. This meeting became known as the Second Continental Congress. Inside a large meeting hall, delegates from across the colonies debated what to do next. Some leaders still hoped peace could be restored. They believed that if the colonies appealed directly to the British king, perhaps the conflict could be resolved without a full-scale war. But others were beginning to realize that the situation had already gone too far. British troops had fired on colonial militia. Blood had been spilled. Trust between the colonies and Britain had nearly vanished. So the delegates made an important decision. They would create a unified army to represent all the colonies. This new force would be called the Continental Army. Now they needed someone capable of leading it. Several names were considered, but one man stood out. He was tall, calm, and widely respected. He had military experience from the earlier French and Indian War, and perhaps most importantly, he came from Virginia, one of the southern colonies. Choosing a leader from the south helped unite the colonies, showing that this conflict was not just a problem in Massachusetts. His name was George Washington. When Washington arrived at the meeting, he did not actively campaign for the position. In fact, he appeared humble and reserved. But many delegates already believed he was the right choice. On June 15, 1775, George Washington was officially appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. When he accepted the role, Washington made an important statement. He said he would not take a salary for the position. Instead, he would only ask for his expenses to be covered. This gesture impressed many leaders. It showed that Washington viewed the role as a duty rather than a personal opportunity. Soon afterward, Washington began traveling north toward Boston to take command of the colonial forces gathered there. When he arrived, he found a challenging situation. Thousands of colonial fighters were camped around the city, but the army was poorly organized. Soldiers lacked proper uniforms. Many did not have enough ammunition. Food supplies were uncertain. Some fighters had only basic weapons. Others had little military training at all. Washington immediately began working to bring order to the growing army. He introduced discipline. He organized units. He established rules for the soldiers. It was not easy. Many militia members were used to operating independently and did not always like strict military structure. But Washington believed discipline was essential if they were going to stand against the British Army. Meanwhile, the British troops remained inside Boston. The city had become a tense military stronghold. Ships from the British Navy controlled the harbor. Redcoat soldiers guarded important positions within the city. Both sides watched each other carefully. Neither side fully knew what would happen next, but another major battle would soon erupt nearby. Just outside Boston stood a pair of hills overlooking the harbor, Bunker Hill and Bleeds Hill. These hills were strategically important. Whoever controlled them could fire cannons toward the city and the harbor. In June of 1775, colonial forces secretly moved to occupy these hills during the night. They quickly began building defensive fortifications using dirt, wood, and stones. When the British Army discovered this, they knew they had to respond. If the colonists held the hills, they could threaten British control of Boston. So, British commanders prepared an attack. Thousands of British soldiers marched toward the hills under the hot June sun. Their bright red uniforms stood out clearly against the landscape. Meanwhile, colonial fighters waited behind their makeshift defenses. Many of them were inexperienced, but they had strong motivation. They were defending their land. As British troops began climbing the hill, colonial commanders gave a famous order to their men: "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." This instruction meant the soldiers should wait until the British were extremely close before firing, ensuring their shots would be accurate. The British soldiers marched forward in formation, step by step, closer and closer. Then suddenly, colonial muskets erupted in a powerful volley. British soldiers fell as the colonists fired from behind their defenses. The British tried again, and again they were pushed back. But eventually, the colonial fighters began running low on ammunition. Without enough gunpowder, they could no longer hold their position. The British finally captured the hill. Technically, the British Army had won the Battle of Bunker Hill, but the victory came at a very heavy cost. More than 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded during the attack. For the colonists, the battle proved something important. Even though they were not a professional army, they could stand up to the powerful British forces. Confidence began growing among the colonial fighters. The revolution had truly begun, but the path ahead would be long and difficult. The British Empire was still one of the strongest powers in the world, and the young Continental Army still had much to learn. Yet under Washington's leadership, the colonies were beginning to transform from scattered militias into a unified fighting force. The next chapter of this story will explore the moment when the colonists finally made their boldest decision yet, to declare independence from Britain. Part 7. The idea of independence. By the middle of 1775, the conflict between Britain and the American colonies had clearly become a war. Fighting had already taken place at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. The Continental Army had been formed and George Washington had taken command. Yet something interesting was still true. Most colonists were not yet demanding independence. That might sound surprising today. After all, when people think about the American Revolution, they usually imagine colonists fighting to break away from Britain. But in the early stages of the conflict, many colonial leaders still hoped the situation could be repaired. They believed the colonies could remain part of the British Empire while gaining more rights and representation. In fact, in July of 1775, the Continental Congress made one last attempt to restore peace. They sent a message directly to King George III. This message was called the Olive Branch Petition. The name itself symbolized peace. In the letter, colonial leaders explained that they were still loyal subjects of the king. They blamed many of the problems on British officials and Parliament, not the king himself, and they asked for a peaceful solution. But the response from Britain was not what they hoped for. King George III rejected the petition completely. He declared that the colonies were now in open rebellion. From that moment forward, the British government no longer viewed the conflict as a disagreement between citizens. They saw it as a rebellion that needed to be crushed. More troops were prepared. More ships were sent across the Atlantic, and the British Army prepared for a larger war. Back in the colonies, this news shocked many people. The rejection of the Olive Branch Petition made something clear. Peace might no longer be possible. Slowly, more colonists began asking a new question. If Britain refused to treat them as equal citizens, then why should they remain part of the empire at all? Around this time, an influential writer named Thomas Paine published a small pamphlet that would change the conversation completely. The pamphlet was called Common Sense. It was printed in early 1776. Unlike many political writings of the time, Common Sense was written in simple, direct language. It was meant for ordinary people to read and understand, and its message was bold. Payne argued that it made no sense for a small island like Britain to rule a vast continent like America. He said the colonies should become an independent nation. He also criticized the idea of monarchy itself. Why should one king have so much power over millions of people? The pamphlet spread rapidly. Printers produced thousands of copies. People read it in taverns, homes, and public gatherings. Some people even read it aloud to crowds who could not read themselves. The ideas and common sense were powerful, and they began changing public opinion. More and more colonists started believing that independence might actually be possible. Meanwhile, the war continued. British forces still held important cities like Boston and New York. But the Continental Army was growing stronger under Washington's leadership. Soldiers trained harder. Supplies slowly improved. The colonies were learning how to fight together. By the spring of 1776, many colonial leaders realized something important. If they were going to continue fighting Britain, they needed a clear reason. They needed to explain to the world and to their own people why this war was happening. So the Continental Congress began discussing a bold idea, declaring independence. Such a declaration would be risky. It would officially separate the colonies from Britain. If they lost the war afterward, the leaders could be executed as traitors. But if they succeeded, they would create an entirely new nation. During the summer of 1776, a small group of delegates was chosen to write a document explaining why the colonies deserved independence. This group included several important figures: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Together, they worked on a document that would become one of the most famous political writings in history, the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote most of the document. His words explained the colony's belief that all people have certain natural rights, rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The document also listed many complaints against the British king, explaining why the colonies believed he had violated their rights. After weeks of debate and revision, the document was ready, and on July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress officially approved it. With that single decision, the 13 American colonies declared themselves free and independent states. The United States of America had been born. Of course, declaring independence did not end the war. In many ways, it only made the struggle more serious. Now the colonies were no longer fighting for rights within the empire. They were fighting for survival as a new nation. The British Army would soon launch major campaigns to defeat the rebellion, and the young United States would face some of its greatest challenges yet. The next chapter of our story will follow the war as it spreads across the colonies, testing the courage and endurance of the Continental Army. Part 8. The war spreads across the colonies after the Declaration of Independence was approved in July of 1776. The American colonies were no longer simply protesting British rule. Now they had taken a bold and dangerous step. They had declared themselves a new nation, the United States of America. But declaring independence on paper was only the beginning. To make that declaration real, the colonies would have to win a war against one of the most powerful empires in the world, and the British government was determined to stop the rebellion. By the summer of 1776, Britain had assembled a massive military force. Thousands of soldiers crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Warships filled the harbors. Experienced generals prepared for large campaigns. Their plan was straightforward: defeat the Continental Army quickly and crush the rebellion before it could grow stronger. Their first major target would be one of the most important cities in the colonies, New York. At the time, New York was a vital port and trading center. It also sat in a strategic location between the northern and southern colonies. If the British captured the city, they could control the Hudson River and divide the colonies in half. General George Washington understood how important New York was, so he moved the Continental Army there to defend it. But the situation was difficult. Washington's army was still young and inexperienced. Many soldiers had little formal training. Supplies were often limited, and some troops only signed up to serve for short periods before returning home. Meanwhile, the British army arriving in New York was massive. More than 30,000 soldiers eventually gathered there. It was the largest army Britain had ever sent overseas. The contrast between the two forces was striking. On one side stood the disciplined, well-equipped British army supported by powerful naval forces. On the other stood the Continental Army, determined but still developing. The first major battle of the New York campaign took place in August of 1776 on Long Island. British troops launched a carefully planned attack against Washington's forces. Using superior numbers and better training, they outmaneuvered the American defenders. The battle quickly turned against the Continental Army. Washington realized his army could be surrounded and destroyed. If that happened, the revolution might end before it had truly begun. So he made a difficult decision. Instead of continuing the fight, he chose to retreat. During the night, under thick fog covering the harbor, Washington quietly evacuated his entire army across the East River back to Manhattan. It was a remarkable escape. Thousands of soldiers, horses, and cannons crossed the water without the British army realizing what was happening. Even though the battle had been lost, the army had survived, and survival was critical. Over the next several weeks, Washington's army continued retreating as British forces pushed them out of New York. The Continental Army moved north through Manhattan, then across the Hudson River, and eventually through New Jersey. For the soldiers, this was a difficult time. Cold weather approached. Supplies were low. Morale was fading. Some men's enlistments were ending, and they planned to return home. British troops seemed unstoppable. Many observers believed the revolution might collapse before the year ended. But Washington refused to give up. Even as his army retreated, he continued looking for opportunities. He understood something important about the war. The Continental Army did not need to win every battle. They simply needed to survive long enough to keep the revolution alive. And as winter approached in 1776, Washington began planning a bold move that might restore hope to his struggling army. It would involve a surprise attack during one of the coldest nights of the year, a risky plan that many believed could fail. But if it succeeded, it could change the entire course of the war. The next chapter of this story will take us to a freezing December night when Washington and his soldiers prepared to cross the icy waters of the Delaware River. Part 9. The Crossing of the Delaware. By the end of 1776, the American Revolution was hanging by a thread. Just a few months earlier, the colonies had proudly declared their independence from Great Britain. But now, things looked very different. The Continental Army had suffered several defeats during the campaign in New York. British forces had pushed Washington's soldiers out of the city and chased them across New Jersey. Many Americans began losing hope. The army was shrinking. Soldiers were tired, hungry, and cold. Some had no proper boots for the freezing winter weather. Others had enlistments that would expire at the end of the year. If too many soldiers left the army, the revolution could collapse before the next spring. General George Washington understood how serious the situation had become. He needed something that could restore confidence. A victory, not just any victory, but one that would inspire the colonies and show the world that the Continental Army was still capable of fighting back. And so Washington began planning something bold, a surprise attack. Across the Delaware River, in the town of Trenton, a group of enemy soldiers had taken up winter quarters. These soldiers were not British troops, but German mercenaries known as Hessians. The British had hired thousands of Hessian soldiers to help fight in the war. They were experienced fighters and well respected for their discipline. But at Trenton, they had grown comfortable. They believed the exhausted American army posed little threat during the winter. Washington decided to prove them wrong. His plan was simple in concept, but extremely dangerous in practice. On the night of December 25, 1776, while many soldiers on both sides celebrated Christmas, Washington would lead his army across the icy Delaware River. After crossing, they would march several miles through freezing weather and launch a surprise attack on Trenton at dawn. It was a risky plan. Winter storms were common. The river was filled with floating chunks of ice, and if the Hessians discovered the attack early, the Continental Army could be caught in a disastrous fight. Still, Washington believed the risk was worth it. Late that night, as snow and freezing rain fell from the dark sky, soldiers quietly gathered along the riverbank. The wind was sharp and cold. Boats waited in the darkness. Large wooden vessels called Durham boats would carry men, horses, and cannons across the river. Washington stood among his soldiers, calm but determined. He knew the entire revolution might depend on what happened next. One by one, the soldiers climbed into the boats. Rowers pushed away from the frozen shore. Ice scraped against the wooden hulls as the boats moved slowly through the dark water. The crossing took hours. The weather made everything harder. Freezing rain soaked the soldiers' coats. Wind whipped across the river. Some men struggled to keep their balance as ice shifted around the boats. But despite the terrible conditions, the army successfully reached the opposite shore. Now they faced another challenge: the march to Trenton. Soldiers moved through the snow-covered roads during the early morning hours. Some wrapped their feet in cloth because they had no proper shoes. Others left faint trails of blood in the snow. Still, they kept moving. Washington divided the army into groups and approached the town from different directions. Just before sunrise on December 26, the attack began. American soldiers rushed into Trenton from two sides. The Hessian troops, completely surprised, scrambled to organize a defense. But confusion spread quickly. Within a short time, the Continental Army surrounded the town. After brief but intense fighting, the Hessian commander surrendered. Nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers were captured. The American army had achieved a stunning victory. And perhaps even more important than the victory itself was the effect it had on morale. News of the Battle of Trenton spread quickly across the colonies. For the first time in months, Americans felt hope again. The Continental Army had proven that it could defeat professional soldiers. Washington followed the victory at Trenton with another success a few days later at the Battle of Princeton. These victories forced British troops to pull back from parts of New Jersey. More importantly, they restored confidence in the revolutionary cause. Soldiers who had planned to leave the army decided to stay. New volunteers joined the fight. The revolution was alive again, but the war was far from over. Britain still controlled major cities like New York and had the resources to continue fighting for many years. For the young United States, the struggle for independence would require patience, endurance, and courage. The next chapter of this story will explore how the war expanded and how the Americans slowly began gaining support from powerful allies. Part 10. The turning point. After the surprising American victories at Trenton and Princeton, the war did not end. But something important had changed. Before those battles, many people believed the American Revolution would quickly collapse. The British Army was larger, better trained, and supported by the most powerful navy in the world. Yet Washington's daring winter campaign proved something different. The Continental Army could fight, and more importantly, it could survive. Throughout 1777, the war continued across the colonies. British leaders began planning a new strategy. Their idea was to split the colonies into two parts. If they could isolate New England from the rest of the colonies, they believed the rebellion would weaken and eventually collapse. To accomplish this, British General John Burgoyne developed a plan. His army would march south from Canada along the Hudson River Valley. At the same time, other British forces would move north from New York City. If the plan worked, the British would gain control of the Hudson River and cut the colonies in half. At first, Burgoyne's campaign moved forward successfully. His army captured several American positions and advanced through the wilderness of upstate New York. But the journey became slower and more difficult. American soldiers destroyed bridges, blocked roads with fallen trees, and attacked supply lines. Local militias joined the resistance. Farmers, hunters, and volunteers from nearby towns began gathering to oppose the British advance. Slowly, Burgoyne's army found itself surrounded by hostile territory. Supplies ran low. Reinforcements never arrived as planned. Meanwhile, American forces under General Horatio Gates prepared to stop the British advance near a small town called Saratoga. The fighting there would become one of the most important moments of the entire war. In September of 1777, the first major clash took place. British troops attempted to break through American defensive positions, but the American soldiers held their ground. Weeks later, a second battle erupted. By now, the American army had grown stronger as more militia joined the fight. They launched aggressive attacks against Burgoyne's exhausted forces. The British lines began to collapse. Realizing that his army was surrounded and unable to escape, General Burgoyne made a dramatic decision. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered his entire army to the Americans. Nearly 6,000 British soldiers laid down their weapons. It was one of the greatest victories the Continental Army had achieved. But the importance of the Battle of Saratoga went far beyond the battlefield. Across the Atlantic Ocean, powerful European nations were watching the war carefully. France, in particular, had been quietly supporting the American colonies with money and supplies. The French government disliked Britain and saw the revolution as a chance to weaken its longtime rival. However, France had been cautious. They did not want to openly support a rebellion that might fail. The American victory at Saratoga changed everything. Now it seemed possible that the colonies might actually defeat Britain. Soon after hearing the news, France made a historic decision. In 1778, France officially recognized the United States as an independent nation. Even more important, France entered the war as America's ally. This changed the balance of power dramatically. France provided money, soldiers, weapons, and most importantly, naval power. The British now faced not only the Continental Army, but also the military strength of France. The war had become international. Battles would now take place across the oceans as British and French fleets clashed. For the young United States, this alliance brought new hope. The revolution was no longer a small colonial rebellion. It had become part of a global conflict. But the fighting in America would continue for several more years before the final outcome became clear. In the next chapter of our story, we will explore how the war moved into the southern colonies and how the struggle for independence grew even more intense. Part 11. The final campaign. By the late 1770s, the American Revolution had entered a new and difficult phase. The British still controlled several important cities, including New York, which served as their main base of operations in North America. But the war had grown more complex, especially after France joined the fight. British leaders realized that defeating the revolution in the northern colonies had become increasingly difficult. So they began shifting their attention toward the southern colonies. Their new strategy focused on places like Georgia and South Carolina. British commanders believed the South contained many loyalists, colonists who still supported the British crown. If those loyalists joined the fight, the British hoped they could regain control of the region and slowly push northward to crush the rebellion. At first, the British seemed successful. In 1778, British forces captured the city of Savannah, Georgia. Soon afterward, they launched a major campaign against Charleston, South Carolina, one of the most important ports in the southern colonies. After a long siege, the city surrendered in 1780. It was one of the largest American defeats of the entire war. Thousands of Continental soldiers were captured. For a moment, it seemed the British southern strategy might actually succeed. But controlling the South proved more difficult than British leaders expected. While the British Army has major towns and cities, the countryside remained dangerous. Local militias began fighting back. Small groups of American fighters launched surprise attacks on British patrols and supply lines. These fighters knew the land well and could disappear into forests and swamps after striking their targets. One of the most famous leaders during this time was Francis Marion, often called the Swamp Fox. Marion and his men used quick, unpredictable attacks to harass British forces across South Carolina. Their tactics made it extremely difficult for the British to maintain control. At the same time, the Continental Army reorganized its southern forces. General Nathanael Greene took command of the American army in the region. Greene understood that his army could not always defeat the British in direct battles. Instead, he used a strategy of movement and endurance. Sometimes he would engage the British army in battle. Other times he would retreat, forcing the enemy to chase his forces across long distances. This strategy slowly wore down the British army. Even when the British won individual battles, they suffered losses that were difficult to replace. Over time, that position in the South became weaker. Eventually, British General Charles Cornwallis decided to move his army north into Virginia. He hoped to regroup and receive support from the British Navy. Cornwallis established his position in the coastal town of Yorktown in 1781. At first, it seemed like a safe location, but events were about to unfold that would trap the British Army in a dangerous position. General George Washington saw an opportunity. Together with French forces under General Rochambeau, Washington began moving south toward Virginia. At the same time, the powerful French Navy sailed toward the American coast. In September of 1781, the French fleet defeated the British Navy in the Battle of the Chesapeake. This naval victory prevented British ships from reaching Yorktown. Cornwallis and his army were now trapped on land with no escape by sea. Soon, American and French troops surrounded Yorktown. The Allied armies began building siege lines and slowly closing in. Day after day, cannons fired into the British defenses. Cornwallis's soldiers were exhausted. Supplies ran low. There was no rescue coming. Finally, on October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered his army. More than 7,000 British soldiers laid down their weapons. The war was not officially over yet, but the surrender at Yorktown effectively ended the major fighting of the American Revolution. For the colonies, it was the moment they had struggled toward for many long years. The dream of independence was becoming reality. But the story of how the United States officially gained its freedom was still unfolding. In the final chapter, we will see how the war came to an end and how a new nation began to take its first steps in the world. Part 12. The end of the war. After the dramatic surrender at Yorktown in October of 1781, the American Revolution had reached its most important turning point. The British Army had lost one of its major forces in North America. General Charles Cornwallis and thousands of his soldiers had surrendered to the combined American and French armies. News of this defeat quickly traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to Britain. When the British government learned about the disaster at Yorktown, many leaders realized that continuing the war would be extremely difficult. The conflict had already lasted more than 6 years. It had cost enormous amounts of money. And now Britain was fighting not only the American colonies, but also powerful European nations like France and Spain. Many members of the British Parliament began questioning whether the war was still worth fighting. Public opinion in Britain slowly began to change. People were tired of the long conflict. They wanted peace. Meanwhile, in America, the mood was very different. After years of struggle, sacrifice, and uncertainty, the possibility of true independence finally seemed within reach. But the war was not officially over yet. Even though large-scale fighting had mostly stopped after Yorktown, both sides still needed to negotiate a formal peace agreement. Diplomats from the United States traveled to Europe to begin these negotiations. Among the most important American representatives were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. They met with British officials in the city of Paris. The discussions were complicated. Both sides needed to agree on several major issues. The Americans wanted Britain to officially recognize the United States as an independent nation. They also wanted clear borders for the new country. After months of negotiations, both sides finally reached an agreement. In 1783, the two nations signed the Treaty of Paris. This treaty officially ended the American Revolutionary War. More importantly, Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. For the first time in history, the 13 colonies were now a free and independent nation. The borders of the new country stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Mississippi River. It was an enormous territory for a young nation, but winning independence was only the beginning of a new challenge. The United States now had to figure out how to govern itself. During the war, the colonies had been loosely connected through an agreement called the Articles of Confederation. However, this system created a very weak national government. Congress had limited power. It could not easily collect taxes or enforce national laws. As the new nation began growing, many leaders realized that the government needed to become stronger and more organized. This realization would eventually lead to one of the most important moments in American history. In 1787, representatives from the states gathered in Philadelphia to discuss creating a new system of government. Their work would lead to the creation of the United States Constitution, a document that would shape the nation for generations. But at this moment in history, the most important victory had already been achieved. After years of war, hardship, and determination, the colonies had succeeded in their fight for freedom. A new nation had been born. The United States of America had entered the world stage. Part 13. Building a new nation. After the war ended and the United States gained its independence in 1783, the new nation faced a huge challenge. Winning freedom was only the first step. Now the former colonies had to figure out how to govern themselves. During the war, the states had operated under a system called the Articles of Confederation. This agreement created a loose union of states with a very weak central government. At first, many Americans supported this idea. They had just fought a long war against a powerful monarchy, so they were cautious about creating a strong national government. But over time, serious problems began to appear. The national government had very little power. Congress could not collect taxes directly from the states. Instead, it had to ask each state for money. Many states refused or delayed payments. Because of this, the government often struggled to pay soldiers, settle debts from the war, or maintain a stable economy. Trade between the states also became difficult. Each state could create its own rules, taxes, and currencies. This created confusion and competition instead of cooperation. Some states even placed taxes on goods coming from neighboring states. It began to feel as if the states were acting like separate countries rather than parts of one nation. Another serious problem appeared in 1786 in Massachusetts. Farmers facing heavy debts and high taxes began protesting against the state government. The protests eventually turned into an armed uprising known as Shays' Rebellion. Although the rebellion was eventually stopped, the event shocked many American leaders. It showed how unstable the young nation could become without a stronger government. People began realizing that the Articles of Confederation were not working well enough. In 1787, leaders from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia to discuss possible changes. At first, their goal was simply to improve the existing system. But as discussions continued, many delegates realized that small changes would not solve the deeper problems. Instead, they began working on an entirely new plan for government. This meeting became known as the Constitutional Convention. Some of the most influential figures in American history were present. George Washington served as the president of the convention. James Madison played a major role in designing the structure of the new government. Alexander Hamilton argued strongly for a stronger national system. For months, the delegates debated difficult questions. How powerful should the national government be? How should different states be represented? How could power be balanced to prevent tyranny? Eventually, they created a new framework that divided government into three separate branches. The legislative branch would make laws. The executive branch, led by a president, would enforce those laws. And the judicial branch would interpret the laws and ensure they followed the Constitution. This system was designed to create balance. Each branch would have certain powers, but none would become too powerful. This idea became known as checks and balances. The document they created was called the United States Constitution. It would become one of the most influential political documents in world history. But even after it was written, the Constitution still needed approval from the states. Some people supported it strongly, others worried that the new government might become too powerful. This debate would shape the next stage of the young nation's history. In the final chapter of our story, we will explore how the Constitution was accepted and how the first leaders of the United States began guiding the country into its future. Part 14. The first steps of the United States after months of debate and careful discussion. The new Constitution was finally completed in 1787, but writing the document was only the beginning. For it to become the law of the land, it still needed approval from the states. Across the young nation, people began discussing the new system of government. Some Americans strongly supported the Constitution. They believed the country needed a stronger national government to survive and grow. These supporters became known as the Federalists. Leaders like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote a series of essays explaining why the Constitution was necessary. These essays later became famous as the Federalist Papers, but not everyone agreed. Many Americans feared that the new government might become too powerful, similar to the British rule they had just escaped. These critics were called anti-federalists. They argued that the Constitution needed stronger protections for individual freedoms. The debate was intense. Town meetings, newspapers, and political discussions spread across the states. People everywhere were talking about the future of their new country. Eventually, supporters of the Constitution made an important promise. They agreed that once the Constitution was approved, they would add a list of protections for basic freedoms. These protections later became known as the Bill of Rights. With that promise, more states began supporting the new system. By 1788, enough states had ratified the Constitution for it to officially become the government of the United States. The next step was choosing the country's first president. There was one man that almost everyone trusted, a man who had led the Continental Army during the long years of the Revolution, a man respected for his leadership and his dedication to the new nation. That man was George Washington. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. When Washington took the oath of office in New York City, It marked the beginning of a new chapter in history. The United States was no longer just an idea born from revolution. It had become a functioning nation with a new government, a constitution, and a future to build. Washington understood how important his role would be. Everything he did would set examples for future presidents. He helped establish traditions that still exist today. He formed the first presidential cabinet. He worked to stabilize the nation's economy, and he focused on keeping the young country united during its fragile early years. The journey from 13 colonies to an independent nation had been long and difficult. It included war, sacrifice, uncertainty, and bold decisions. But in the end, the United States had succeeded in creating something new, a republic built on ideas of representation, law, and liberty. And as the years passed, the nation would continue growing, changing, and shaping the course of world history. And now, as this gentle journey through early American history slowly comes to an end, if you enjoyed relaxing with this calm story of the past, and if these quiet history moments help you unwind or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing to the channel Try Sleep 4. Here, we explore peaceful stories from history, slow storytelling, and relaxing journeys into the past. Perfect for quiet evenings, calm nights, or falling asleep while learning something new. So, if you like more slow, relaxing history like this, make sure you subscribe to Try Sleep 4 and join us again for the next peaceful story.